In this video, I'm going to show you how I set up my little watercolor palette with custom color mixes, and then I'll give you a step-by-step tutorial on how I like to play with watercolor and colored pencil to draw these flower illustrations. Last year, I really started getting interested in watercolor, and I bought this empty palette and decided to fill it with all my favorite colors because I was so uninspired by the basic beginner watercolor palettes that I kept trying to use. I just found the primary colors in these palettes weren't suited for my art, and I could never figure out how to use them properly. So I went to the art store and I decided to pick out just a few colors, whatever caught my eye, which at the time happened to be these four by Daniel Smith: Potter's Pink, Payne's Blue Gray, Quinacridone Gold, and Buff Titanium. I went home to play with these colors and let myself break the quote-unquote rules of how to use watercolor, and I was really surprised by how many shades I could mix with just these four. And then my collection of watercolors grew as I started using them more and more, and now they're really one of my favorite mediums to work with. I just maybe don't use them in the traditional way. So now my palette needs to be refreshed. I am running low on a few colors and I wanted to add in some new ones. So here is how I do that. Starting with this pink tone, which is just Potter's Pink and Buff Titanium mixed together, I wanted to try a new Potter's Pink. So I'm actually going to be using this one by Winsor & Newton, and I did a swatch of both brands that I have for you to see the difference. Winsor & Newton is slightly more pink, while Daniel Smith is a little bit more red. I'm using a palette knife to mix my colors and just squeezing a bit of paint into the pan and then mixing that up. I just add what it needs as I go, so here I thought it needed a bit more pink, and I also wanted to try adding this new color I have, Rhodonite Genuine, just to brighten it up a little bit. So when the color is all mixed, I'm going to swatch it to see how it looks. This pink is lovely, but I want it to be just a tiny bit brighter, so I'm going to add more Rhodonite Genuine. After this last swatch, I think it's perfect, so I'm going to set this aside and start on my next color, which is a beautiful dusty blue. This blue is made with Buff Titanium and Payne's Blue Gray, so I'm going to mix those just like I did with the last color. I decided to add a little bit of Prussian blue to this one, just a tiny bit to deepen the blue shade. So let's swatch this and see how it looks. I think it's perfect. This is exactly what I was going for. Next, I have two colors that need to be refilled, but they are very similar, and I just want to keep one in this palette. So I'm quickly swatching them so I know what I'm working with. One is more pinky purple and the other is more gray, so I think I want to keep that first one in this palette. This color is made with Buff Titanium, Payne's Blue Gray, and Potter's Pink. As I was mixing this, I realized I made it a little bit too blue, so I scooped out some of that paint into an extra pan to save it because I don't want to waste any, and now I have more room to add a little bit more Buff Titanium and Potter's Pink. After painting a swatch, I think this is the perfect shade. Next, I have two more colors that I mixed that are very similar and I just want to keep one. So again, quickly swatching these to see what I have. I kind of want a nice golden olive green. So I'm going to start mixing this shade with Payne's Blue Gray and Quinacridone Gold, and then maybe adding a little Potter's Pink as well. The Quinacridone Gold is very bright, so I'm only adding a tiny bit at a time so that it doesn't overpower the color. I could also add one of these brown shades I have if the green turns out a little bit too bright. On the first swatch, I realized it was very close to this other green that I have in my palette, which I just swatched right next to it. So it's not quite what I'm going for. I added a little bit of raw sienna, a little more gold, and finally more Potter's Pink. And I think that I have made the perfect shade that I was envisioning. So now the rest of these colors I have are straight out of the tube, so I don't need to mix anymore. These pans in the center row I stuck in with a little piece of tape to make sure they didn't move around. First, refilling this one, it's Rose Doré by Winsor & Newton. It's a lovely transparent pink, which actually doesn't really look anything like the color printed on the tube, but I still love it nonetheless. This blue doesn't need to be refilled yet, but it's actually Lavender by Daniel Smith, although I do find that it looks more periwinkle to me than lavender. Then I couldn't tell exactly what this one was, so I'm doing a quick swatch and comparing it to the other green that I showed earlier. And I realized this one in the middle row is Undersea Green by Daniel Smith. It's a really beautiful mossy green. The other green is a mix of Payne's Blue Gray, Quinacridone Gold, and a little bit of sepia. Then I have this pan of sepia by Daniel Smith. This color is Green Gold by Daniel Smith. This one up here is Potter's Pink. Next to it is Buff Titanium. Then I have Payne's Blue Gray. This one here is a beautiful brownish red. It's called Red Jasper Genuine by Daniel Smith. And finally, this black in the corner is actually not a watercolor. It is liquid charcoal, which I had no idea existed until I saw it in an art store, and I was so curious I had to buy it to try it out. It has a very similar consistency to watercolor, but it is a little bit grainier. You can squeeze it out into a pan and let it dry and then rehydrate it to use it. And it's so beautiful. I absolutely love it. I don't often need black paint, so this is a nice alternative when I do need a dark shade. Now I'm going to add some new colors into this palette because as I've been using it, I realized that I was missing a few shades that would be nice to have for my work. So grabbing some clean pans, I'm going to fill them with these 3 colors, all by Daniel Smith. They are Pyrrole Scarlet, Rhodonite Genuine, and Prussian Blue. And now I'm going to place all of my pans back into my palette. Turns out I have space for one more pan, so I figured why not mix one more color to play with. I decided to make a purpley pink shade with Buff Titanium, Rhodonite Genuine, and a little bit of Prussian Blue. Here's the final shade, and I'm so excited to try this out in my work. And here is my final palette. These colors are so inspiring to me and I can't wait to use them. So I'm going to set this aside and let the colors dry and harden over the next couple days. Now I'm going to swatch every shade in this palette just so you can see all these beautiful colors on one piece of paper. Now I want to show you one way that you can play with watercolor. It's how I love to use it, which is to layer watercolor and colored pencil to make some really beautiful illustrations. And here's a peek into my sketchbook. The majority of these pages I drew with just watercolor and colored pencil, although a few might have other things like crayon or paint mixed in. I just love playing with the textures and colors that you can create by combining multiple mediums. It's so much fun. I'm always experimenting in my sketchbook, always scribbling, just trying out whatever ideas pop into my head. This illustration here is a perfect example of just watercolor and colored pencil mixed together. Here's another one. All these flowers were done with watercolor and colored pencil. So now I'm going to show you how to draw these 4 different flowers, which I promise are so simple to do. To start, let's go over some different paper options that I like to use. First, the Strathmore cold press watercolor paper is an all-around great option for both price and quality. It has a somewhat textured surface, so watercolor looks really nice on this. And you can also use colored pencil, although the pencil won't go on as smooth since the paper surface is textured. This Strathmore mixed media paper is a great affordable option that works really well with both watercolor and colored pencil. I wouldn't use it for just watercolor, but if you're mixing mediums like I do, obviously, as the name indicates, This paper is great. The surface is mostly smooth with just enough tooth to grab onto the watercolor. Bristol paper is another option, although not my favorite to use with watercolor, but pen or dry mediums work so well on this, and I use it a lot, so I wanted to mention it. It's really smooth and just lovely to draw on. And now a more expensive option is Arches paper. This is cold press paper, so it has a pretty textured surface, which makes watercolor look so good on it, although it is a little rough for colored pencil. My top choice is the Arches hot pressed watercolor paper. Because it's hot pressed, the surface is a little smoother. The paper is slightly off-white, which I love. Watercolor looks beautiful on it, and since the surface is smooth, colored pencil goes on so nicely, and the colors show up brighter than other papers. It is expensive, but I really notice a difference with this paper, so I think that it's worth it. Now for brushes, I say just use whatever you have, but I really love these Princeton Velvet Touch brushes. They are pretty affordable and I think they work really well. For colored pencils, I have a bunch of different brands that I like to use. I would really recommend just going into an art store and picking out whatever colors look fun. Don't buy a set because you'll get a bunch of colors that you'll never use. And you don't need to start out with the primary colors, you need shades that inspire you. Prismacolor is an all-around great option. It's affordable and it's pretty good quality, and so many shades to choose from. My favorite expensive option is Caran d'Ache Luminance pencils. These are so silky smooth to draw with, and the colors show up really vibrantly. I love them. Derwent drawing pencils are another brand that I like. The color payoff is really great. The only qualm that I have with them is sometimes they are difficult to sharpen to a point. They just tend to break easily. And finally, one more brand I like is Faber-Castell Polychromos. These are affordable and they come in really pretty shades, but some colors don't draw as smoothly as others, so you just kind of have to test them out. Let's get started with our flower illustrations. I have here a piece of Arches hot press watercolor paper, and I'm going to be using a round number 3 brush. So you can do these flowers in any colors you want. This is really something that you can take and make your own, so don't feel like you have to copy me exactly. I'm starting with light pink, and you want to loosely paint a blobby shape for this first flower. Make sure your brush is really watery to help this blob shape form. No need to be precise, we will carve in the petals later. Now we need to let that sit and dry before we add a stem, so let's continue on to the next flower shape. For this one, I'm using a blue color. Once again, keep your hand loose and paint some bulb shapes for these flowers. For this one at the top, I'm keeping the petals kind of closed, but then with the other ones, I'm having the flower open up at the end with these little bits poking out. While we let this dry, we'll move on to the next one. This flower is going to have 3 petals, starting with this bulb shape once again, and then these loose petals going off to the sides. I'm going to take a darker pink and add a little dimension to this, some shadows around the edges and a vein running through the petals. Again, don't worry about being perfect here because we are going to go over this with colored pencil. Now I'm taking a pause to go back to the first flower because it's mostly dry at this point, and I'm going to add a darker center. And then with my red shade, I'm adding a little bit of shadow to a few edges of the petals as if they were slightly curling in on themselves. Okay, finally, we're going to do the last flower. Again, I'm using light pink for this because it's just a good base color, but feel free to use any light shade that you want. For this, make a bunch of tiny little misshapen circles kind of spaced out in a row, and you can do as many as you want. While these are still wet, I'm taking some other colors and lightly tapping that into the shapes. Add some water so the colors kind of melt together, and you can do any colors you want. This is just to make them look a little bit more interesting. Now let all these flowers dry before moving on to the next step. I'm using a green shade to add a stem to the first flower. Load up your brush with paint and start with 2 tiny leaves at the base of the stem. Then drag your brush down to make a jagged line. Then we're going to add a leaf, so make a little stem and then draw a kind of pointy leaf shape. This doesn't need to be perfect, and fill that in with paint. I'm also adding some more saturated green to create veins in the leaf and the shadows. For the next flower, I wanted to do a different colored stem, so I'm mixing a kind of brownish green. Start by making these little caps at the end of the flower bulbs. Then lightly draw a stem, keep your hand loose so it's kind of wobbly, and connect the flowers to it. I'm going to use the same color for the stem on the next flower, once again starting off with a cap underneath the petals, and then this one has these little wispy bits coming off of it. Then trace your brush downward to create the stem. You can add a leaf or two coming off of the stem. I did a similar jagged leaf shape as we did with the first flower. I traced the outline and then I filled this in with paint. And I also added a little bit of darkness just to create some depth on the stem and leaves. And finally, for the last flower, going back to that first green color, create little leaves kind of encasing these flower buds. Then draw a stem and connect everything to it. And lastly, I'm adding a few tiny green buds coming off of the stem in a few places. Now we are all finished with the paint. We need to let these flowers dry completely before moving on. These simple flower shapes are pretty on their own, but let me show you how you can add colored pencil to make these really bright and beautiful. You don't really need any specific colored pencils for these flowers, just use whatever you have and you'll be able to make it work. I grabbed a few colors that I thought paired well with the watercolor shades that I used. So pick a color to start with and lightly begin shading in parts of the petals on the first flower. Don't press too hard, we are going to slowly build up the colored pencil and blend it all together. I'm using this dusty purple color around the edges of the petals. Then start adding some other colors. There's no right or wrong here, we're basically building a gradient of colors on the petals. So I'm just going back and forth with a bunch of different pencils to start creating this effect. Again, keeping my hand really light. You don't want to press too hard at this stage because of the waxiness of the colored pencil. If you press too hard, you won't be able to easily add more color on top. Then grab a lighter colored pencil, I'm using a light pink here, and use this to press a little bit harder and start blending everything together. Just go over the entire petal everywhere that you just covered. With a medium tone pencil, I'm lightly sketching out where the edges of the petals might be. I'm looking at the shape of the flower and following that to carve in the petals. Then I'm adding some darker colors to the edges where the petals are curling in. Next, I'm going to take a pause on the petals and work on the center part of the flower. I'm using this Imperial Violet shade. It's a nice darkish blue and outlining that center shape. And then filling it in with a bunch of little circles. I'm taking my medium pink tone to darken around the edges of that center part of the flower, just to define it a little bit more and add some shadow. Then I'm taking an almost white shade. This is a luminance pencil in pink white, and I'm filling in the center of those little tiny circles. Then I'm taking this terracotta shade to work on the petals. I am lightly outlining them using the light pink guide that we drew earlier. And then I'm going to trace lines down all the petals following their shape. Still using the same pencil, I'm then darkening some of the lines around the petals and also lightly adding shadow just so they stand out a little bit more. After that, I'm going back in with a few of my lighter shades just where I feel like the petals might need a little bit more blending to create that gradient of colors. Next, we're going to do the stem. I'm starting with this greenish blue color to lightly sketch on top of the watercolor. Just like with the petals, we're going to create a gradient of colors to make this look a little more interesting than just a flat green leaf. I'm also adding this Polychromos cinnamon color, not worrying too much about perfect placement. Then using this green to start blending the colors together, and I just go back and forth with all these different colors to build up the gradient. Then taking a darker green to start adding in some details like shadows or veins on the leaf. This dark blue is also a nice color to add in those details. I almost never use black for things like this because I find that it muddies up my colors and is usually too harsh for the outlines. Here is the finished flower. Let's move on to the next one. We're going to be doing the same technique as before, where we lightly layer colored pencil and then use a light color to blend it all together and create a gradient. I'm using pinks and purples to go on top of this blue and just doing a light wash all over the flower bulbs and using slightly darker colors around the bottom edges. I'm using a light blue to cover over the entire thing to blend it all together. Then taking one of my purples, I'm using this to sketch loose lines going up and down the petals. I'm not pressing too hard because I want to keep these lines subtle. Then with my pink-white luminance pencil, I'm adding a few brighter spots to give the flowers a bit more dimension. Then taking the imperial violet color, I'm lightly tracing around the outside of the flowers, and then I'll also use this to add a few darker lines in the center of the petals. Moving on to the stem, I'm using the cinnamon polychromos pencil to add a little bit of color in a few spots. I'm also using my green to add some depth around the edges. Here is the finished flower. Moving on to the next one, by now I'm sure you kind of get the idea of the technique I'm doing here. Using colored pencils that coordinate with the colors of the watercolor you use, you can layer and blend them to create a really vibrant effect. With this flower, I'm using bright pinks to add a gradient to the petals. Then I'm taking a darker pink to trace the outline of the flower and add some light lines to the petals, also lightly adding some shadows to separate the petals at the base. And then I'm using the same colors that I have been using for the stem and leaves. For the leaves on this one, I'm using my luminance pink-white to add the veins. Then using my terracotta color, I'm going around those white lines of the veins to make them stand out a little bit more. And finally, I'm using the terracotta pencil to add a little more darkness to the lines on the petals. And now this one is finished. On to the last design, we have this little branch of rosebuds. This one is super simple. You just add different pink and purple tones to the petals, lightly building up the color until you have something that you like. This luminance pink-white pencil is really great for blending colors together because it's so buttery and smooth, so I really like adding this on top of everything. Then taking my terracotta pencil and making sure it's sharpened to a point, I'm tracing around the flower petals and then drawing some lines down the flowers just to show their shape. And lastly, I'm using the same colors I've been using to add some dimension to the stem. I'm using this imperial violet to very lightly add a subtle outline to parts of the stem and leaves. I feel like this just helps make it look a little bit more polished. To finish it off, I'm adding a little bit of this pink-white to a few spots on the leaves. And now look at this cute little branch of tiny roses. That's it for this tutorial. I hope you try out these flower ideas in your sketchbook and then take the technique and see what else you can come up with. Have fun playing with your materials and don't worry too much about making it perfect. If you want to, check out my Instagram or TikTok. I share more creative ideas and also behind the scenes of the projects I'm working on. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.